Hi everyone, EasyPeps here, welcome to another Houdini tutorial. In this video we're going to dive into particle simulation to create this kind of effect, which somehow should resemble like solar flares, and we will have a particle surface and we will create some custom force that will expel some of our particles to the outwards. So starting from a Houdini empty scene, let's create a geometry node. We will call this particles and dive inside. In here, we want to drop down a sphere. This will be our surface. And let's set it to polygon with a frequency of 20 for now. And also set the radius to 1. We want to assign some normals to it, to the points. And just feed into a pop network right away and dive inside the pop network. So here, let's disable the guide. We already have our particles. Now, as always, even before taking care of our simulation, we want to create some density value to differentiate the particle generation. So let's go back and we need more resolution. So let's set the frequency to 100 and also double the scale. We want a uniform scale of 2 and drop down a point bob. We will call this density and dive inside. In here we want to use some noises to drive the density value, so let's drop down a anti-aliased noise, and we want this to be animated over time, so we don't want to feed directly the position. First we want to convert the position and the time together to a vector 4. So position here and time on the second input, and this will be fed into the noise. So if we plug it into the color and set the display flag, we have an animated noise. Now also put down a multiply for the time and promote the second parameter. So we can call this speed, and if we play it now, set it to real time and also set your FPS value. Why isn't it moving? Oh, because it's 0 by default. So now we do have control on the speed and set it to 0.1 for now. And back inside the point VOP, what we want is actually to use this noise to drive another noise. So we will create an interesting pattern for this effect. So for the first noise, we want to set the max octave to 1. And we can increase the roughness a little bit and also the frequency, let's say 1.5. And we want to use the output of this noise, but we need to set it to 3D as output and feed this into a second noise. So now if we use the second noise to drive the color, we will have something like this. And the second noise we want to set it to original Perlin, and we can play with the parameter, let's say 0.8 for the roughness, and let's decrease the frequency. Yeah, something like this should work. And lastly, we want to add another noise to create some little more variance on the surface. So let's take another turbulent noise, and this time we will use just the position. Let's set this original Perlin, and we want to add it to the other noise. So let's add it. And for this one, we want a higher frequency. So let's say something like this. Decrease the amplitude and play with the roughness. And we want to feed this second one. We know that the original Perlin goes from negative 0.5 to 0.5 and decrease the destination max just to introduce some variance on the bigger noise. Now, back inside the density warp, we want to take a bind export. We will use this value to drive the color, but we also want to bind it to the density. And if we check the values, they're going from negative 0.4 to 1, so let's add another fit range also for the color, so we are sure that we are including all the values, so from negative 0.03. So now we do have correct values, and now we can go back into the popnet, and on the source tab we can use the density value to drive the emission of the particles. And also let's set the life expectancy to 6 and the variance to 2. And we don't see much of a variation. And let's go back into the density warp. Let's use the fit value only for the color, so we have all the color, all the value to remap our future colors, but let's don't use the fit for the density, so we have those negative value, and this should introduce a little bit more of contrast. Let's set the point visualization to pixel. Yeah, it's already better. And now we want to start to introduce some forces. So for our particle movement, let's go back inside the pop network. We will have a couple of basic pop forces. Let's take one right away. So we will have a couple of these to establish the basic movement of our particle. Then we will have two custom forces, one that will keep the particle on the surface of the sphere, and the other one will take care of the flare effect, the expulsion of the particle. So let's connect the first pop force, and here you can enable the guide to see the effect. Right now you don't see anything because the amplitude is set to 0. Let's set it to 1 for now, and if you put in play you can see the effect of the force. We want a slower one, so let's set the pulse length to 10 and also increase the swirl size, let's say to 4, and the amplitude will need to be very low, so let's say 0.06. Let's disable the guide. We want something more like this. Of course, right now we don't have the surface attraction force, so all the particles are going away. So before moving on, it's a good idea to create our surface force, and we will do it with this combination of volume gradient and volume sample we used other times. And this time I won't go into the details of how this node works. I will point to another video where I did an explanation on this stuff. But basically, if you remember, with the volume gradient, we get a vector that will point to our surface. And by multiplying with the volume sample, we also get the correct magnitude for this vector. So let's say this is one of our particles. We have this vector that will increase as the particle moves farther away from the surface. So by subtracting this vector from the particle position, we can keep the particle stuck to the surface. So back to our scene, the first thing we need a volume. So let's take a VDB from polygon, plug the sphere, and here let's set a lower value, let's say 0.06, and we want to fill the interior also. And this will go into the second input of our popnet. Now we can dive inside the particle simulation, and here we will create our surface with a pop-up. So let's take one, and on the inputs tab we want to set the input 2 as the second context geometry. So basically we are feeding this one, so the volume. Let's call this one surface and dive inside. So here let's make some space, and we want to take a volume gradient and a volume sample. Both of these will take the opt input 2 as the file name and will sample our position. Then we want to multiply this one with the other, so like this. and we want to subtract this from our current position. So take the point position, the multiply as the second input, and this will go into our final position. So by default, now the particles should be all stuck to the surface, and they are. And we don't want those to be completely stuck, so also let's promote this third input of the multiply. We will call this amp. And let's see, now it's 0, let's try 0.1. So now the particles are somewhat stuck. Let's increase it to 0.4. And also we want to use a pop drag. Let's set the air resistance to 2, and let's decrease again the amplitude here to 0.1. Whenever you're working with particle, it's a lot of going back and forth and find the correct balance between the forces. Also, on the pop drag, we want to randomize this a little bit, so we will enable use Beck's expression and stop it to open. And we want this to be multiplied by some random value. So let's type it iResist, which is this parameter name. If you hover with the mouse, you can read it. And we want to multiply this value, so star or equal. And let's take a random over the ID, which is basically the PTNAM of the particle. When you do it on the particle, it's better to use the ID because the PTNAM will be recycled when a particle dies. The ID will remain always the same for a point, even after it's dead. So we do have something like this, and we don't want to randomize from 0 to 1, so let's fit it, fit 0, 1, and let's say 0.6 and 1. Yeah, let's leave it as it is for now. So now that we have our particles confined, we can duplicate this pop force, and we use the first one with a swirl size of 4. So let's say this was the low frequency. We want to add another one with a higher frequency, so something like this. And let's also increase a little bit the amplitude, so 0.1, and the pulse length decrease it to 4. Disable the guide, and let's see. We already introduced more movement. So this is the basic movement of our particles. Now we want to create the flare effect. And to do it, we are going to create another particle simulation that will spawn some points on the surface. And this point will have a velocity that will point outwards. So let's say like this. We will transfer the velocity to our simulation points. Now, the fact that we're using a simulation for the green points means that also those points have a relative age, and we can use that age to create basically a radius attribute that will expand around those points and will create the expansion of the flare effect. So in practice, let's go out from our simulation and create another pop network. We want to feed the normal node and dive inside. Let's disable the guide. Here we want very few particles for this one, so let's set the constant birth rate to 2. And for the life, set the expectancy to 5 and the variance to 0.5. So let's also enable the point visualization. We have something like this, very few points. Now let's get outside, and here we want to take a point wrangle so we can calculate the relative age, because now the age of our particles, let's filter the attribute, and also the life, as you can see, is going from 0 to the maximum life. We want this value to be from 0 to 1, and we can actually overwrite the current age, so it will be at age divided by at life. So now we do have a value from 0 to 1. Also, let me zoom a little bit on this, but there will be not so much coding for this tutorial. So now here let's delete a few attributes because we only need the normal and the age for this one. So let's delete non-selected and write n and age, and also delete the group. We don't need that. Now let's take a copy to points so we can visualize what's happening, and let's copy a sphere on this. So we do have our points. Now we want to set the p scale, so let's take a point wrangle on the points, and we want to use the age for the p scale, so at p scale will be equal to the relative age, which is the age now, and we want to remap it with a ramp, so ch ramp, we will call it p scale, and let's create this pair parameter and create the ramp. We want to set it to b-spline, and we want to make something like this. So we have this kind of p-scale over the life of the particle. So now we want to transfer this value to our main simulation before the actual simulation. So let's take another point bop after we compute the density, and we want to use the points, not the copy to points. This was just to visualize the p-scale. We want to use the points as the second input of this point bop and dive inside. Now, in here, we already have the normals on our points. So if we take our normals and feed it into the velocity, we have nothing if we don't create the visualizer. Okay, we have this. All right, and for the time being, let me decrease the frequency so it will be more clear. We have the velocity going outwards, right? Now, we want to take the points of the other simulation and sample a few attributes from those points. So we need a PC open, which is a point cloud open. This will basically open a point cloud from an input, and we set the second simulation on the second input. So this is the file, and we want to sample our point position, so this one. And on the PC open, we want the search radius to be 1 and the number of points to be 1, because we just want to sample from one point at a time. And now to say which attribute we want to sample from the point cloud, we need a point cloud filter. First, we want to sample the position, so here is already correct. And if we subtract our current position from the position of the point cloud, we get this. Meaning now we have a point here. If you check, yeah. So our velocity is pointing away because we are subtracting the position. Now let's normalize this one so it will be more correct. And we need to reverse this input, so Shift R. And we do have something like this. Basically, the idea is that the point will be sucked towards the center of the explosion and then pushed outwards. And to do that, we need to mix these two values, the normal and this other vector we just calculated. And literally, we are going to use a mix for that. So we will mix from the current normal to the new vector we calculated. So now if we move the bias, we have something like this, right? And what we need to drive this bias is the distance from the point to the explosion. So let's take a distance node, and we want to measure the distance from the current position to the second point and use this as the bias. So as you can see now, if the point is here, we have this kind of movement. And to be properly correct, this distance in theory should be remapped, but by basically not remapping, we are clamping some values, and this clamping is giving us this nice slope, so I want to leave it as it is. And also I just realized that we are taking the point normal, so we don't actually need the normal on the second simulation, but we are not even caching it out, so whatever. I just wanted to make it clear that the normal, which is pointing outwards, is not coming from the second simulation, but is from the normal we created on the sphere. So now the vector is correct, but if we scroll the timeline, you can see that this velocity suddenly appears, of course, because the points are just spawning and dying. So we want to use that p-scale that we calculated to drive an animation on this velocity. So let's copy the PC open, and we copied because this time we want to sample a few more points. Let's say 4, it will be more smoothed as a result. Let's also copy the PC filter, but this time we want to sample the p-scale, which is a float channel, and we will use this p-scale to, let's rearrange, we want to use a multiply here after the mix, and we want to use the p-scale to multiply it. So now we have a growing velocity, which also decreases over time according to the p-scale. And even if you see some flickering here, this is because we are in SOP context. Once in the simulation, the velocity will be added and not overwritten each frame, so this will be fine. And even better, now we can use this p-scale also to drive the radius, as we talked before. So let's put the frequency back to 100 and disable the point visualization, so it will be more clear now. So here, of course, we can use this p-scale to drive the radius of the same p-scale. This will glitch the reality, I believe, and kill us all, so don't do it, please. Let's duplicate this a second time. And we want to use this to drive the radius. So now, not only is growing in amplitude, but also in radius. And even if it seems very uniform things, as it is right now, once in the simulation mixed with the other forces, it will look much better. So let's rearrange here, and let's see on this one, it's okay. And on the second one, let's set it to 2. And everything else should be fine. So let's go back into the simulation and see what we have. As you can see, something is happening. Now the problem is that the surface force is preventing our particle to be expelled so much. That's why we are seeing so few of those. Also, let's check if they are taking the velocity, and they are. Basically, now we need to turn off the surface force whenever the explosion are happening. So what we want to do is to go back where we define the velocity, and we want to bind this p-scale to another attribute. So let's take a bind export. We will call this one attract, and let's create a visualizer for it. Let's change it from black to white. Where is it? Grayscale. So we can basically now multiply the surface force for this attribute, but we need to be inverted because we need the zone of the explosion to be black. So let's go back here. Let's take a fit range, and from 0 to 1 will become from 1 to 0. So we have something like this, and now we want to blur it. So let's take an attribute blur, and we want to blur attract, let's say 30 iteration, something very soft. So back again in our simulation, we want to go inside the surface, the pop-up where we define the surface, and we want to multiply our volume things also for the attract. So let's take it with a bind. It was called attract, and we want to multiply it as a fourth input. So hopefully yeah, we have more particle escaping. Now as a final touch, we want to do basically the same thing for the pop drag. So here on the pop drag, let's also multiply for f at attract. And this should give the expelled particle more less drag. Yeah, as you can see, they are going much farther. Maybe right now there are too much particle going away, so we can limit that. Here on the p scale, let's multiply it by 0.8, so we have smaller spheres, let's say. Also, let's start to increase the amount of particles, so let's say 60,000, and let's see what we have. As you can see, it's working, particles are flaring out, and I believe it's a very nice effect. So now to prepare our final simulation, let's drop down a file cache and also a point wrangle. Out of our simulation, we want to calculate again the relative age for this particle. So like before, f at age will be equal to at age divided at life. So we have the relative age, and we also want to use the original color value for our final colors, but right now it's a vector. We don't really need three values, so we will convert it to some float attribute that will be lighter on the disk. So let's write a float attribute called call, and we will explicit cast the current color vector. So now we have this call attribute, which is a float. Now, before caching out, let's clean the geometry. And here we want to keep the call, the age, and the speed that we'll use for color remapping. And also we need the velocity and the ID if you want to use motion blur. So let's keep those attributes and delete the rest. Let's also delete the groups. Any groups. Let's go into the file cache. Here I prefer to do explicit. I will just paste my simulation path and let's add a null. So this will be out particles. And for the amount of particles, of course, it's up to you. For my final animation, I cranked up this number to 600,000, so 10 times more. And you just need to save your cache to disk. So this is the flipbook of my simulation. Of course, we can't see the color, even the original one, because right now it's binded to a float attribute, but I think the animation is okay. So let's close this. And for the karma part, I will quickly go over my setup. There is really nothing much going on here. So let's see, I just created a sub create, and here in a point wrangle I created a new p scale based on the age, which we saved in the simulation as attribute, with a new minimum and maximum value, and also with a ramp over the age. Then I believe the only other thing is in the material, it's just one material for the particles. And I took here the float attribute, which was call. If you need to take an attribute in karma, you need to use this one, geometry property value. You write the name and the signature, and you remap it as you want. So I remapped basically the call value and also decreased the maximum source. Apparently I wasn't getting enough of the last value, and I plugged in into a color ramp to have some color. As it seemed, I ended up not using even the speed ones. Then all into a material library, I created a couple of light. And let's see the render. with Karma XPU. Let's change the background to dark. And the only thing you need to keep in mind for the motion blur here, you need to turn on the velocity blur, because by default only the object transformation blur will be on in Karma. You need to say velocity blur on, and then it will be based on the velocity attribute that we saved also. And I actually in Redshift you need also the ID. I'm not sure here, but that's the reason why we kept also the ID attribute. And that's basically it. I just rendered an animation to have something nice to show on the social and on YouTube, but typically with this kind of stuff, you don't even want to render like this. You want to set up an IOV and compose it later on in some software like Nuke. So this video was more about the technique on the point simulation itself. And that's it for this video. Like usual, if you like the content, drop a like and maybe subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next one.